So this topic, Gaia, can be approached from many different directions. And in the meditation we just did, we've looked at Gaia perhaps through the awareness of the right brain, right hemisphere. But although it's a very ancient name, Gaia is the name of the Greek goddess of the earth, very important in Greek religion and mythology. And I'll mention that in a moment. But actually, now it's come back into use as the name for a very precise, actually, very rigorous scientific theory. So left and right brain, I think, coming together in an interesting way. So I'm going to talk today more about that scientific theory, because a lot of the time when people talk about Gaia these days, the actual theory of James Lovelock is not very much in the foreground, and it is very important, I think. James Lovelock himself doesn't talk about it much now. He seems to prefer to talk more about climate change and nuclear power and things like that, and what's wrong with the green movement. But his earlier books, not so much the later ones, his earlier books are very, very clear and very original thought and very good science. It hasn't got a good reputation in the academic scientific world. It's usually talked about as a bit doubtful, and maybe some weak version of the theory might be okay, but these strong versions, that say that Gaia, the planet, is a living organism, that's too much. And I was quite startled to find that I couldn't discover a really good talk on the internet about the actual basic theory. And that's quite interesting. Lots and lots of people talk very enthusiastically about Gaia as a spiritual, inspirational thing, or as, as an inspiration for the green movement, a way of, thinking about the earth. And I think very much in the right brain, intuitive kind of way. But nevertheless, it was some hard-nosed science that gave birth to this idea. So I want to come back to that. Possibly next week, I'll talk more about those other aspects. So the theory began, we can more or less say, that has historical antecedents as well. But James Lovelock's theory really began in 1965 when he was brought in as a consultant for NASA. They were going to send the Viking probe to Mars, and they wanted to find out if there was life on Mars. And he was a very famous chemist, and somehow got involved in this project. Not quite sure whose idea it was to call him in. But he looked at the experiments they were designing to find life on Mars. And he said, you're going about it the wrong way, because they were sending out instruments in a little sort of experiment machines that were robots that would do experiments to find out whether there was life on the surface of the planet. And he said, you based your whole program on the assumption that life on Mars is going to be very similar to life on Earth, because they were looking for specific chemical compounds and so on. And he said, well, there's no reason to think that that would be the case. And they kind of agree. Right? It seems reasonable, but why should it be the same as it is on Earth? And they said, well, what would you look for then? And he said, I would look, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but basically what he said was, I would look for a system that was not in chemical equilibrium. So any kind of closed vessel, if you like, any box with chemicals in it in a environment, those chemicals may be reacting with each other, but after a while they stop reacting with each other because the thing reaches equilibrium. But life tends to create That's right. I remember what he said. He would say, I would look for a reduction in entropy. So entropy is this physical concept, which in an interesting way kind of measures the amount of disorder in a system, the amount of chaos, if you like. So, for example, ice, solid water, ice, has a very specific crystalline structure. Whereas liquid water, the molecules are just kind of going around anyhow. So ice is more structured than water. It's more ordered. Liquid water is more disordered. And this has a very important consequence. It takes a lot of energy to melt ice, even at 0 degrees, to water at 0 degrees. So life has this very extraordinary tendency to create order. You can see, like a tree grows out of the earth, the soil is very, it looks like kind of disordered, very, very random kind of thing. And then you get this amazing structure of a tree. That's a very crude analogy, but it actually is true that life has this tendency to create systems that have less entropy, less disorder than they should have from a physical chemical point of view, if everything was just left to itself. And so he looked at the composition of the Earth's atmosphere and compared it with the atmosphere of Mars and Venus and found that they were exactly in chemical equilibrium and the Earth was wildly out of equilibrium. We have 20% of oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen is extremely reactive gas. If there was no life, I mean, this is jumping the gun, but he said, where is this? Shouldn't be happening. Why is it happening? It can only be happening because living organisms are actively creating oxygen all the time. Now, then, interestingly, the next observation is, well, these organisms can't live without oxygen. So they have to create it, and they have to get the amount of oxygen right. So what is called the biota, the totality of all the living organisms on Earth, is actively maintaining the level of oxygen in the atmosphere so that it is hospitable, if you like, to life. Life can flourish. If we had too much oxygen, then the forests would all burn down, and lots of creatures would die. If it got way too much, then all life would die. And if there wasn't enough, same would happen, essentially. So he looked into this further and discovered, and he realized actually that this must be true of all of the kind of environmental variables on which life depends. So, for example, fish and so on can't live in the sea if there's more than a certain amount of salt, because the tissues of the body can't withstand that amount of salinity of that salt. And he looked into it and found if it wasn't for things that living organisms are doing, there would be perhaps 10 or 20 times as much salt, which would be far too much for life. Lots of things like that he found. And he came up with a general theory of why living organisms necessarily interact with the mineral environment, if you like, the non-living environment, in such a way that the conditions for life are maintained. And he compared this to the environment inside a living organism. So your body is maintained generally at very precise temperature, much more so than the external environment. The external environment can vary by 50 degrees centigrade or more, and you'll still be able to probably survive. But within your body, it's 37 degrees, and if it's 3 or 4 degrees either way, you're in big trouble. So you can see it's very obvious, and physiologists understand a lot about how within an organism, the internal environment is maintained very precisely. And he said, well, this is also true of the Earth as a whole, or the biosphere as a whole. Just like a living organism or a living cell, it actively maintains the chemical and physical conditions that allow it to survive. And he explained very clearly exactly how and why this is so. It is in terms of feedback loops. So if something goes way off, If an organism is producing too much of something that's poisoning the environment, then of course the population of that organism will be reduced because it's being poisoned. So so there is this very remarkable tendency for life to create the conditions for its own survival. And he's documented this in huge detail. The basic theories explained very well in his first book called Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. It's not a very hard book, it's not a very long book, it's quite understandable, and it gives you a very clear idea of the theory. And the second book, called The Ages of Gaia, goes through the whole evolutionary story of the Earth, showing how these control mechanisms evolved and why. And it's a beautiful theory. Now, it's then acquired a bit of an extra dimension. Well, actually, right there from the beginning, there's a biologist called Lynn Margulis, who's a very extremely eminent biologist. I don't think she ever got a Nobel Prize, but she got some, very, very prestigious awards for her work. She's revolutionary. And she got involved at the same time with the NASA project, and so she'd been working with Jim Lovelock ever since. And her contribution was to do with the way, particularly, that microbial life is crucially involved in all of these processes. She was more of a microbiologist, and her most significant scientific contribution was the theory of symbiogenesis. And what that says is that there are two types of microorganisms on the planet. We talk about bacteria, but not all microbes are bacteria. The bacteria are called prokaryotes, prokaryotic organisms. And about 1,000 million years ago, 1 billion years ago, a new kind of organism evolved. So a huge breakthrough in evolution, possibly the biggest breakthrough ever in evolution. The eukaryotic cells, an amoeba is an example. It's not a bacteria. And the cells in your body are eukaryotic cells. All the macroscopic organisms, all complex life is made of eukaryotic cells, which are much more complex than the prokaryotic ones, the bacteria. And her proposal was that what had happened was that the first eukaryotic cell was a colony of different bacteria, which was symbiotic with one another. So they were able to perform much more complex biochemical operations, and they could produce a much more sophisticated form of life that could survive in new ways and could evolve in new ways. And then, lo and behold, a few 100 million years later, these eukaryotic cells evolved into multicellular organisms. There have been multicellular organisms before, but not organized in the way that birds, fish, and mammals, or even insects, are organized. So it's another tremendous evolutionary breakthrough. And so this series of events, there's an earlier one that's very important as well. So up to about 2 billion years ago, there was practically no oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth. And the organisms then, all of them bacteria at that time, were anaerobic bacteria, that is, they didn't need oxygen. And some bacteria at this point started to produce oxygen. They were very successful, produced enormous quantities of oxygen, which basically killed off most of the life forms because they couldn't tolerate it. It's a very toxic gas. And again, a new form of life emerged. That's very interesting there, because all the time in this vast span of evolutionary time, the sun is, or the energy of the sun that's heating the Earth is getting stronger because the sun is expanding, and for various other kind of physical chemical reasons, it's radiating more heat. So it's now radiating to the Earth about 30% more heat than when it started. But the Earth's temperature has remained pretty well constant, because if it didn't, life would not survive. And so when it goes too high, life responds just through natural feedback mechanisms, not some magic, but necessarily, if you look at the way the dynamic equilibria of the system are, that then it will automatically respond to cool the temperature down. So this is the carbon dioxide in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And originally our atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide and methane, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. Now there's very little of those gases. We are making more carbon dioxide and we're warming up the Earth, which is a big problem. So that is, an outline of the theory. And I say Lynn Margulis's work showed lots of fascinating detail about how these incredible complex ecosystem of microorganisms, bacteria, and other microorganisms contributes to this geophysiology, the physiology of the Earth, this radical phrase that he created. Just one example, the erosion of rocks, very important process in the geological history of the Earth, is speeded up by life by a factor of 1,000 times. Life has colossal impacts on what happens. It's a very, very powerful system. Whereas if you compare it with, say, Mars and Venus, there's no sign of anything like this at all. Possibly in the very early history of Mars, there may have been a Venus, we don't know. But of course, Venus is far too hot, Mars is far too cold and too dry. And the same with the outer planets, none of them could possibly support life in any form remotely like it is on Earth. I don't mean just chemically and physically similar. You would have to mean something completely different by life for it to be possible on those planets. As I say, this theory actually gives us a definition of life that is quite profound. It is this type of system that is able to actively maintain its own environment, external and internal environment, so as to allow its own continued survival, when in fact it is, from a physical and chemical point of view, it's totally paradoxical. One way of putting it is that we shouldn't be able to exist because we're, the laws of chemical equilibrium don't really allow it. Of course, that's not quite, the laws are not so strict. There are exceptions. And there's a very interesting book actually explaining exactly from a physical chemical point of view, the principles which make this possible. There is a branch of, so when we're talking about equilibrium and entropy, we're talking about thermodynamics. And thermodynamics says everything tends to go to equilibrium. That's a basic, third law of thermodynamics. That's generally how it's stated. But there is a branch of thermodynamics called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And there are this very famous scientist, Ilya Prigogine, he did get a Nobel Prize, I'm pretty sure, for this work, described and investigated systems which are able to keep themselves away from physical and chemical equilibrium. We call them dissipative structures. They dissipate entropy into the environment. They send their entropy out, they export it, and they create the opposite of entropy, which is order, which is, organization. So this is another key to, clue to what makes life life, if you like. All looking at it from a physical and chemical point of view, this. But you can see how the picture builds up of this amazing, intricate, interdependent web of life that is all the time, all those organisms are contributing to each other's well-being and survival, if you like. So this is the picture that I tried to, draw out of you in the meditation. And this is, the right brain, the intuitive mind, accessing what is Gaia. I'll talk for a bit longer about this, but I may continue this theme also next week. So here we have a scientific theory, which is absolutely a theory of interdependence. It's absolutely a holistic theory. It's very different from the kind of scientific theories that were the mainstream of science from Descartes, Galileo, and Newton in the 17th century through to not just we're not talking quantum mechanics and relativity here. These are still reductivist, if you like, left brain science. In my opinion, Gaia theory is at the heart of an even more profound revolution, more profound than relativity and quantum mechanics. Because we're talking here about holistic science. We're talking about the science of complexity, so things like chaos theory and fractals. All of these things are they represent a different approach to science. We now have, the nuts and bolts, if you like, the fundamental laws. Okay, physicists are still looking into the fine details. They haven't quite got everything right with relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and they're still investigating the fine structure of the subatomic particles. And who knows whether they'll ever come to an end. They can go on doing that. And it's got to a point, if I may be a little bit disrespectful here, a lot of it seems to me now, it's like, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? We could go on down this road forever, trying to tunnel further and further and further into the depths of that super sub-microscopic structure of the universe, or the macroscopic structure. We've got a very, sophisticated picture already, but what we don't have is any really good comprehensive way of understanding what's happening at the human scale, because our human world, trying to describe it from the point of view of Newtonian physics is impossible. And you can't describe life from the point of view of Euclidean geometry either. This beautiful, elegant, simple system has only 4 axioms, and everything can be deduced from that. But most things don't look like that at all. So you've probably heard of fractals. This French mathematician, Benoit Mandelbrot, it's wonderful stuff. I mean, he said his theory, so Euclidean geometry is the geometry of regular figures. And his geometry is the geometry of irregular figures. That's everything else. However wild and wacky it is, it can be described by fractal geometry. It can't be described by ordinary Euclidean geometry. And in the same way, these new emerging branches of science, complexity theory, chaos theory, and so on, and Gaia theory especially, in my view, are giving us ways to handle, to understand incredibly complex systems. I mean, the human body is an unbelievably complex system, 50 trillion cells. And as I said in the meditation, 90% of those are not biologically, if you like, yours. They don't have your DNA, and they are bacterial cells. Without them, you couldn't live. So they are, in fact, part of you. And the ways in which those enormous number of cells are interrelated, and the complexity of the processes they're carrying out, and the internal complexity of any one cell is stupendous. And yet there are ways of understanding, how these systems, if you like, work. So Gaia theory is the big one. How does the living system of the Earth as a whole, considered as a single complex system with an uncountable number of interdependent parts, how does that function? And this is, I think it is right brain science. Of course, it uses the left brain, deductive reasoning and so on. And it gives us a way in to join up, if you like, the right brain's intuitive awareness that we explored in the meditation of this infinitely complex, interdependent web of life that we are part of, and that even within our own body, there's this unbelievable complexity and interdependence there. And our right brain is able to tune into that and relate to that. The left brain is a linear. It analyzes things down a single path of logic. It's very powerful at doing that, but it completely misses the big picture. The right brain, is able to integrate that somehow. And when they talk to each other, which is where I think Gaia theory, does open a door to that. It's not only Gaia theory, and many other aspects of this. What I think is, it's a colossal scientific revolution, and a lot of scientists have focused on, can we, encode all the DNA of all the organisms on the planet? Can we find out everything about, all of the elementary particles, how they're related to each other, and the precise, exact laws of how galaxies move and everything? In my opinion, that's an old story. We can go on doing it forever, and I'm sure we will go on doing it forever. But where I think the leading edge of science, personally, where I think the leading edge of science is now, is this holistic science that Gaia theory is the central example of, and all of these other things and these branches of mathematics that are different from, 17th, 18th, 19th century mathematics even, which enable us to explore the world of the real world. Physics works in a laboratory and occasionally works in the real world. It doesn't work very much because the situation out there is too complex. But these new types of theory that I think do have a connection with the right brain, in that they are holistic, they look at whole systems. They are very interesting, and they are opening up insights and ways of looking at, ways of thinking about reality that are very different, and that may be very significant in the transition that I think as a species we have to make, as a civilization, we have to make from being way too overbalanced towards the left side of the brain, the analytical side, the conceptual thinking, the linear logic, the reductivist or reductionist way of looking at the world. That way of looking at the world, unfortunately, cannot deal with life per se, with the actual nature of life. It misunderstands and misrepresents the real nature of life. So when they discovered DNA, now we have the key to life. We understand how life works. Well, that was totally untrue. It was a significant bit of the picture, but the picture is so much vaster than the story of DNA. And there are many paradoxical things that just don't fit with the idea that somehow, using this reductionist science that takes DNA as the fundamental building block of life, and now we in principle understand how life works. It's very easy now to understand, if you look into certain aspects of biology, that simply isn't the case. So Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiogenesis and wider, and she explored the whole field of symbiosis, which is an incredibly rich field of how organisms interact with one another and are interdependent with one another. Of course, this is a whole basis of ecology, if you like, as a science. And other Brian Goodwin, very interesting person. He was originally at one point he was the director of or the professor of the public understanding of science at the Open University. Is that right? I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe he was head of science at the Open University, and he then went on to Schumacher College, and his research was on how the complex structures of living organisms, like the intricate forms of plants and everything like that, whilst Richard Dawkins and co were saying, well, it's just the genes, it's a program, but he was looking into the actual mechanisms, how these intricate forms and structures actually develop. And there's it really isn't anything to do with DNA at all. And DNA may have a role to play in, as it were, deciding which structure is going to happen. But the way the structures are created has nothing to do with DNA. It's a very fundamental mathematical process, mathematically, governed process that, and all life, living forms are of this kind. The DNA, the genetic code, if you like, it really it just sort of flips a few switches, and then the incredibly complex forms develop through their own inherent, as it were, mathematical logic. And things like fractal geometry and complexity theory and so on can give us insight into how that works. So all of this, whole new way of looking at the world, if you like, a toolkit for understanding life in a way that Newtonian science cannot. This has, it's kind of gathered and focused around Gaia theory in a way. All of these things you can look at as part of Gaia theory. I think in 200 years' time, historians of science will look back and say, this was a revolution comparable to the 17th century, what's called the Copernican revolution. It's Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and so on. This is looked at as the greatest revolution in the history of science. I think that Gaia theory and the associated kind of scientific theories that go along with it will be seen as the great breakthrough, where in the 17th century we found an incredibly powerful way of understanding the physical world. Now we need to understand the living world. We need a totally different kind of science, and this is what I think Gaia theory is. And it looks like I'm running out of time, so the second part of my talk, which is going to be about moving away from the strictly scientific point of view. And I hope this hasn't been too technical and over scientific for you. Tried to make it, reasonably sort of intelligible. But it's good to understand that there was hard science here, very deep science. But together with that, there is also, spiritual modes of awareness that relate to it, and philosophical ways of understanding. And of course, the Buddhist theory of interdependence is absolutely right at the heart of this. So I guess that's enough for today. And next week, I'm not sure. I was going to suggest we look at a talk which is with Joanna Macy, being interviewed by someone called Jem Bendell, who Natine and Rowena know about, but I'm not sure. I have to think about that. I may put that back a week, because I may just want to talk part 2 of Gaia, but I may incorporate it into that talk. So we'll see which way it goes. Anyway, I better stop there and just open it up for the discussion. Thank you.